As a real estate investor or an aspiring real estate investor, it's important that your business entities are set up correctly. Otherwise, it could be detrimental to not only your personal finances, but also your business. So, in today's episode, we talk with attorney Michele Leonelli from Focus Law Group about the 4 biggest mistakes to avoid when setting up your first or next LLC. Let's go. Welcome to Royce of Real Estate TV, where we talk all things real estate investing and personal finance to create a life that you love. Make sure that you hit like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. So glad you're here today. Thank you for joining me for this conversation. And this is something, Michele, that a lot of investors ask when they're starting to build or get interested in being a real estate investor. But before we dive into that, give me a little bit more about your background, because you have a really intriguing experience in your journey as an attorney.
Yeah, hey, thanks. Good to be here. My background, yeah, it's usually a bit of a long story, so I'll try and keep it brief for today. I'm from Australia originally. My father's Italian, my mother's Australian, and so I sort of grew up a little bit between both countries as a kid. I moved to the States when I was 14 and lived all over the States as well. Lived in the Deep South initially, college in St. Louis, law school in DC, then went to live in LA and worked for a huge global corporate law firm for a number of years. Left that to move to Austin in 2015 to go in-house as general counsel for a high-tech manufacturing company that was just getting formed. And then after 4 years of that, I, took some time off, and I'd been pondering it for a long time. I've been thinking sort of, how am I ever really going to figure out who I am if I just keep following, like a treadmill sort of approach to life. And I just decided to quit my job and pack a bag and get rid of everything else. And I bought a one-way ticket to Italy, and I had no plans after landing there. And so that sort of saw me floating around the world doing a number of different things, having a number of different sort of personal experiences. I lived in an alternative consciousness community in southern Portugal for a while. I worked in the kitchen there. I worked at the front desk of a youth hostel on the southern coast of Sri Lanka for a couple of months in exchange for room and board. And yeah, it saw me sort of getting back to Australia right before COVID happened. And so COVID then found me sitting on my mom's couch. Not very sexy, but it's, that's where I was at the time. And so, thinking stupidly that COVID would just end at some point and I would get back out on the road, reached out to a mate of mine from law school from Georgetown and said, hey man, like he's got his own firm. And I said, hey buddy, can you send me some contract work so I can just get a few dollars coming in the door? And that was 2020. And that, that sort of took off, and I really started to enjoy what we were doing together. Whereas before, when I left I left the States and I left my job, I didn't really have any sort of vested interest in remaining a lawyer. I thought I'll just sort of see what the universe presents. And I wasn't in love with it. I didn't mind it, but I wasn't in love with it. And so this iteration of working as an attorney, working with Focus Law, working with my classmate Mick, I just fell in love with, so much so that at the very beginning of 2021, after working remotely with him, I moved back to the US. I moved back to Phoenix to really put my shoulder into that operation. And initially thought I'd only come back for a year and then move back to Australia, having somewhat of a practice that I could manage from abroad. But I just loved the work so much that I stuck around. And so I moved back to Austin, which is sort of my community in the States. But yeah, I've just continued to grow the practice and absolutely love it. That's me on the personal side. On the professional side, what do I do? Why do I love what I do so much? I work primarily as outside general counsel. So that means I'm a company or an investor or an entrepreneur's lawyer when they don't have one, full time in their staff, but they need good legal counsel, in a fractional capacity. And so I work with investors, high growth companies, so startups, and then established small to mid-sized businesses. And I work across jurisdictions and across industries. So it's quite a varied practice. But I jump in and do all sorts of things, from forming entities, LLCs and corporations, and all the structuring work and all the organizational work that goes on there, drafting my clients' contracts and reviewing and negotiating all their agreements with their partners and clients and vendors and suppliers. I help my clients raise money. So I do the legal work for fundraising, and then I do a lot of M&A work. So I help folks buy and sell businesses or assets or stock. And that combination of things, I think, variety being the spice of life, has kept me really active. And very engaged. And as part of that niche, I have a very robust practice working with folks in the real estate world, which is, I think, why I'm here today. But, it's one of my passions for sure. And I love working with, divergent areas of that industry, whether it's sort of someone who has like just a secondary property as a rental, all the way through to people, doing big fundraisings for stuff in the commercial space, and everything in between. And part of that in between space is the fix and flip community. I have a number of clients in this space, and it's a really fun space because I feel like no two deals are the same. You're bringing real estate in, you're bringing people in, and where those two things mix, you generally have like an infinite amount of combinations for what can go wrong and what can go right, and how to
Right.
avoid and potentially sort of like encourage those two things in different ways. So
That's
it's been a great place to work in.
That's incredible. And when we were first introduced, the first image that came to my mind is you need to replace is it Modelo guy that's like the most interesting man in the world?
I think you're
Most
too
of the time,
kind.
correct me if I'm wrong, but typically attorneys are not known to be very lively cocktail party attendees, and you seem quite the opposite of that. So, and it's incredible that your journey has really brought you full circle to find a passion within law. How is a properly formed LLC one of the most important things that real estate investors have to have?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we get this a lot. I get this a lot in this practice. I mean, the key thing that an LLC does for you is keep you protected from liability personally. And so absolutely, like, do not do anything to jeopardize the safety of that structure. And there are a number of sort of like practical ways to make sure that that structure stays nice and strong. Things you want to really avoid doing and things you want to watch out for. But
So maybe so maybe we can talk about
yeah.
the top four things to avoid. So
Okay.
people, if they're looking to form an entity, let's just say even for flipping or maybe as for rentals as well, what are four things that people can do to avoid having an LLC that really has them more exposed and they didn't know that that was the case?
Yeah, yeah. Good. No, great question. I'd say the first thing to avoid is commingling your personal finances with the LLC's finances.
Mm.
For a lot of people, their business, especially in the fix and flips world, and up until, before they get to a certain scale, their business is just an extension of themselves. Their
Mm.
personalities are wrapped into it, right? Because that's how they sell. That's how they go out and they find deals. That's how they work with wholesalers. And so, the things becomes an extension of them. And so, making sure you have the discipline to recognize the financial distinction between yourself and the entity is key, because failing to do that is absolutely one of the main things that can get people into hot water. What that can mean, in practice, if you sort of create a weekly protective LLC, is essentially that, as I mentioned a second ago, the LLC's sort of chief function is to keep you personally safe from liability. So whatever happens in that LLC or to that entity should only blow back onto that entity itself and not to you personally. So where that can go wrong is if the LLC, or if a court, in the instance of someone filing a claim or someone having a dispute with you, is if a court found that the LLC wasn't truly a separate entity, but it was actually an extension of yourself, and you treated it that way.
Right.
And so, a couple of these pointers are going to be along those lines. So yeah, first thing, absolutely do not commingle funds. Separate bank account for your LLC,
Right.
separate QuickBooks. Be very, very mindful of sort of, funds in and out, good bookkeeping. Obviously you're going to move money from your LLC's bank account to yours. That's totally fine. Of course, you're going to pay yourself, no worries. But make sure
Mhm.
that you don't just sort of receive money that the LLC is owed into your own personal account and then pay yourself directly. You want to have that distinction, go that extra step. It might be a pain, but with all the apps and stuff we have today, it's not too much to ask, I don't think.
Right. That's perfect for number one. What about number two?
Yeah, number two is going to be, make sure that you have a well-drafted operating agreement. Do
Mm.
not get into, using an LLC unless you have a properly drafted operating agreement.
Mm.
Second thing I think a lot of people skip over. What's an operating agreement? So very basically put, that is the governing document for your LLC. And they can be 5 pages, they can be 50 pages. They don't all need to be long, sort of scary documents. And I think
Mhm.
part of the reason that people sort of blow through this is because this is a legal contract. Like the less of these we have to deal with in our lives, the better. Let's get on to like selling homes and fixing and flipping and totally agree. Except for the fact that it can be one of the key ways that distinction between you, the flipper, and the LLC are no longer sort of nicely drawn. And so now this thing starts to look like it's an extension of you. Why? Because you didn't go to the extra length to make sure that the governing document for that entity was properly written and signed and kept in a safe place.
Right.
Um, and so really, again, it doesn't need to be anything complex, but it's not worth going to LegalZoom. It's worth
Mhm.
sort of having someone draft it for you. And again, it doesn't need to be a huge project, but it's worth doing right. And this is especially true if you have more than one owner in that business.
I
If
was
you,
just about to say,
yeah, no, go ahead. I mean,
no, to exactly to that point, I was going to say, especially if it's not just you and you have more than one person that's operating, then
yeah, exactly.
mhm,
And I see this all the time. Oh, it's my mate, or it's a business partner. We've been working together on other projects. We trust each other 100%. But if men were angels, there'd be no need for lawyers or contracts. And
right,
unfortunately, things do go wrong. Or sometimes it's just a way of keeping because an operating agreement isn't just there for when the poo hits the fan. Operating agreement is also there to it'll lay out a number of things like how do we make distributions when we sell a home,
right,
right? Who pays for these expenses? Sometimes you have a silent partner who's really just the capital partner, and another and the other member in the LLC will be the fix and flipper, the person who's got the GC experience or who is in charge of marketing. Sometimes it's three people and they have different bailiwicks. Well, it's nice to set those expectations for who does what, how you're going to be compensated, what your respective roles and responsibilities are going to be. That's all going to be in your LLC operating agreement. So it's definitely worth making sure that thing's clear and that 5 years, from the moment that you all go into business together, you can look back at something and go, oh yeah, that's right. We agreed to this.
that's what we agreed upon. Exactly. Well, and you have to think as a real estate investor too, it always takes a small village to get deals closed. So your title company, your attorney, your credit card company, if you're opening a credit card with an LLC, all of them are going to want to see these documents. And
Yeah.
and if you need to, if a partner drops out or things adjust, you can adjust something that you've already laid out. It's much worse to try to work off of oral agreements or text exchanges or you
Yeah,
know
absolutely.
conversations over cocktails years later, especially when a lot of money starts to exchange hands. As much as you might trust your friends or a partner that you've known forever, I mean, you surely know like things can change quite unexpectedly when there's a lot of money that has been made or lost. So that's great. I love that as a number two. What about number three?
So for number three, I think it's imperative that people who are flipping or who are doing more than one property at a time do not commingle assets within that fix and flip entity that they have.
Mm,
Um, or, maybe if they have a large volume of homes at any one time, that they have, rather than just using one LLC that, is sort of the only entity that they have. So like all of the homes that they take under contract go into that, all the homes that they're remodeling stay in that, and then all the homes sit there until they're being sold. That, depending on the size of the operation, there's at least more than one entity that can be used for that purpose. So maybe one is the purchasing entity, or maybe you use one entity for each deal. So, if
mm,
you're a fix and flipper and your bandwidth is like three deals max at any time, great. You have two, maybe three LLCs, and each one of those is sort of the owner of its own property that is then its own project.
mhm.
And the reason for that, for sort of structuring it this way, or for advocating that it be structured that way, isn't so that you go out and call me up to give me more work. It's actually because number one, it will keep the individual assets separate from an issue arising from the others. So if this house catches on fire, the other ones won't necessarily be caught and go down with it. So it's that liability protection that we talked about, but also not just with respect to the business and you personally, but also with respect to the various assets that you now have as part of your fix and flip operation.
Right. And
Um,
one of the things I see with that, Mikkel, is when
yeah,
people think that LLC is some overall umbrella protection against everything, whereas it's not. However, to my understanding, am I correct in
yeah.
thinking and saying like by having different LLCs, it also has the appearance of, hey, I work with attorneys, I know what I'm doing. It's not going to be easy to come after me for these things. Therefore, it might not even be worth your time. What are your thoughts?
I think it's a great point, Tracy. Yeah, I mean, what are we talking about here at the end of the day? We're talking about someone's taking you to court. Like that's the reason for the protections. That's where those protections are tested. And I
Mm,
think it's true, very true to say that the more legitimate your operation is and looks, the more of a deterrent that is to somebody coming after you or thinking, oh, this will be an easy case, or I slipped over and fell here. Like I'm gonna sue this owner because they aren't ready for this or they don't have the resources to handle this. I think that that structure will definitely help to bolster sort of the notion that hopefully you have set things up properly. And as part of that separate structuring, again, each of your LLCs has its own governing documents. It's got its own bank account. And banks now have like ways to make this a very easy sort of accounting process.
hmm
Um, and you could use the same operating agreement from one to the next. This doesn't need to be a ton of additional work, but it's important that they be set up and structured, each of them individually. The other reason for that too is like this gives you the great opportunity of being able to raise funds, for different
Mm,
projects, right? So if it's one LLC per fix and flip project, I have clients that do this. They'll get a source of funding from one of their mates, who put in 50 grand for a project, and they'll split that a certain way. There'll be an arrangement there. When the house in that entity gets sold, the revenue from that goes to the two members differently. Hey, now you have a different property. Maybe you've come up in the world since the first one, right?
mhm.
You got greater credibility. People are banging your door down to give you money. Hey, you're going to get better terms now. So now
Right.
you're going to give away less equity in that arrangement, and you're going to keep more of it when the house sells because you've got a proven track record. So make that a project specific determination and put that property and that project in its own LLC.
Beautiful. And the more organized, say this to my flip school students, it's usually your first few deals that are it is difficult to raise funds because you don't have that proven track record. Whereas once you start to establish yourself, the inverse happens to where people want to give you money. And then you have the challenge of going out and finding more inventory to couple them with. So fantastic point. What would be the last and final one that you would say is a mistake that you see people make with entities, or a mistake that they can avoid?
Yeah, I think the final one here is trying to get too creative with where the entity is.
Mm,
I get a lot of clients come to me and they want to put it in Nevada, or they want to put it in Wyoming, or and there's
right.
different reasons for these things. Some of them are valid, but a lot of them sound like sort of WebMD, like medical advice. But
All roads leads to cancer. Like when you start to type in any of the
yeah,
symptoms,
my
I have a
neck
headache
hurts.
and my shoulder hurts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Cancer. Yep. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep. So you
yeah.
probably don't need that Wyoming LLC if you haven't bought a flip or a house in your life before. Like no need to spend thousands of dollars on that is maybe what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and it's partly the cost, but it's sort of demystifying, or trying to sort of bring back to earth what the LLC does. And in
Mm,
Arizona, especially in a state like that, um, you know, the fees are so low to set up an LLC in Arizona. Really, if you are in the state and you're doing business, if you're fixing flips are in that state, set your LLC up in that state. There's
mm,
generally not great reasons to have it be an LLC from another state. Some states charge really high setup fees, California being one of them. Other states have certain advantages around, maybe that, like Wyoming, certain information isn't public, or isn't publicly searchable. But that's led people to the mistaken belief that like they can't find you, that if
right.
something happens to you, that like no one's going to be able to trace that LLC back to you. And that's not exactly how that works.
Right.
What it means is if someone types in the name of your LLC on the Wyoming Secretary of State website, they won't see, Jim Smith, like they might in Arizona as the principal member, or, as the address that's listed there. So if you're doing something sort of dodgy, or, you truly have some paranoia about being found online, then okay, that is sort of a layer of separation that you can have. But otherwise, there's no difference, right? If that LLC gets sued, the state of Wyoming is still going to forward that letter straight to you, and you're going to have to show up in court personally. And oftentimes setting it up in that other state adds a layer of complexity. So now you
Right.
have a Wyoming LLC. You're doing all of your business in Arizona. Well, you need to register that foreign LLC as that foreign entity as a foreign entity now in the state of Arizona. So you've got two sets of annual reports. Arizona doesn't have an annual report, which is nice. But in theory, if you were in a state that did, you'd have two sets of annual reports. You would have, two sets of filing fees. You would have two set, and now you've just doubled your potentially your overhead, but definitely your sort of administrative headaches. And what's the point?
Right, right. Well, I think the point that I see a lot of people fall into or is thinking that they need to have all this complexity around it as the first thing that they do in their real estate business is I have to have the perfect LLC in the perfect state with the perfect everything before I can ever go out and even start a lead generation exercise, which couldn't be the opposite of what needs to be done to be a successful real estate investor. So I love your really practical, straightforward information. And one of the things that I've heard you pepper out throughout these tips is this doesn't need to be scary, right?
Yeah.
And these operating agreements, even if there is partnerships, even if you're raising capital or flipping or converting houses into rentals, none of this has to be so intimidating that you don't just call an attorney like you that can break it down and make it really simple and say, hey, this is what you need right now for where you're at. Let's start with this and adjust as necessary. So can you give us maybe an idea of if a single person, meaning someone that just is operating by themselves, wants to do a few fix and flips a year, what sort of time would it take to be able to set up an LLC?
That's a great question. It shouldn't be much, really. I'll use Arizona as an example because that's sort of where you are. Arizona's nice. It's really quick to file everything you need to file with the state to get that set up. So, that can happen on day one. Operating agreement draft is, with a lawyer over the course of a couple of days, depending on how busy they are, but it shouldn't be more than, couple of hours of their time if it's just one person. And you're off to the races. I mean, from there,
Right.
you want to get your bank account set up and things like that. But it really isn't that much work, and it's not that much lawyer work either. It's a couple of hours to get everything done, and then there's usually questions along the way, especially for first-time folks. Where do I have to? Is this a public document? Does this need to be recorded or registered anywhere? Sometimes the bank will ask to see a copy of the operating agreement, depending on what their sort of requirements are. But again, these aren't big time commitments from the perspective of our legal time, and so the cost isn't that high, and it's also not a very lengthy process. A few days and you're off.
Right. And with that, you're really paying for the peace of mind.
Yeah.
I always like to say real estate investing is not some casual hobby. It can be a cash intensive business. And even if you're buying one house a year or doing several fix and flips or looking to grow your business, making sure that you have that legal foundation set in place. So as you're doing what you're supposed to be really focusing on, which is the business end of it and not necessarily the legal end of it, bringing someone in like you that can be a partner to them in some way so that they have that peace of mind moving forward with what they're doing, knowing that you're a phone call away is really worth its weight in gold. So I'll
Yeah.
wrap up by saying thank you so much for your time today. How can people find you if they want some advice or talk to you a little bit more about how they can form an LLC with Focus Law?
Yeah, great. Look, first of all, thanks for having me. It's been great to be here. I hope to come back someday. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, please feel free to. You can get a hold of me through my email, which I think will be posted here, but it's Michele, Michele, at focuscompanies.com, PHOCUS companies.com. Shoot me an email and I'd love to chat with you.
Perfect. All right. Thanks. And we hope to see you again.
All righty. Bye.
Which of these tips did you guys find most helpful? Number 1, 2, 3, or 4? Leave a comment below so we can keep the conversation going. And if you like me having Michele on, make sure to let me know that too so I can have him on for more episodes. Lastly, my channel is all about the intersection of real estate investing with personal finance to help you create a life that you love. If you're into that, make sure that you like this video, subscribe, turn on the notice so you know when my next videos come out. I'll see you there.